So, welcome to Inside the Lords, nearly at the end of the year, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the procedure for making laws today. I've kind of done a bit too much politics and not enough procedure, so I wanted to fill you in. When a bill is passed in the House of Lords, eventually resolved, it obviously becomes legislation. And we had an instance this week where a piece of legislation that had been fully gone through the whole process of Commons and Laws was brought back into the Lords by the Lib Dems, essentially, where they put out a fatal motion about the issue of ID cards and voting. Now, this was a massive argument in the elections bill earlier in the year. I spoke on it then. Controversially, for a lot of you who follow me, I was opposed to voter ID, but that got through. And the government had particularly emphasised photo ID for voting. So it should have been done and dusted. You know, the ship had sailed, that's the end of that. But the Lib Dems brought this motion back, saying that they weren't trying to constitutionally overturn anything that had been decided by Parliament, both houses, but they thought that the lack of preparedness for implementing this was going to be a problem, and they wanted to kind of implement and bring about a whole new set of regulations or postpone it or what have you. So we had an interesting discussion went on for ages. First of all, because constitutionally it's very unusual to do this, and whilst the Lib Dems kept saying they weren't trying to reopen the debate, in truth the debate that subsequently followed was a rehearsal of the arguments for and against photo ID at voting. That caused me a problem because I'm not keen on the photo ID situation, but I was just very aware that democratically this was the wrong thing to do. And then in the rehearsal of why photo ID is problematic, it also became irritating that so many people implied that it was particularly the case that for marginal groups, people of particular socially deprived backgrounds, ethnic minority communities, that they would find it particularly hard to get hold of photo ID, as though they were kind of completely hapless and hopeless, even though in fact the government have gone to great lengths to say they're going to provide free ID should anyone want it. So there was just a big to do, and then it came to a vote. The Labour Party in this instance I thought had been reasonable because they had an amendment on the fatal amendment of the Lib Dems, suggesting that the government at least needed to do a review and straight after the next elections to just check exactly whether there had been any material impact on the numbers voting because of the new rules. They didn't press it to a vote, which was the important thing. The Lib Dems forced us all to vote. I actually went, which is quite unusual, and asked the Labour front bench what they were doing, and they had decided to abstain, and I went along with that. I didn't want to vote for the photo ID, which I had voted against and opposed in the past. On the other hand, I really disagreed and disapproved of the rather cynical politicking of the Lib Dems, who were actually trying to subvert the process to get their way, and I thought that was the wrong thing to do, regardless of what they thought politically. So that's one bit of lawmaking. Secondly, we came to the end of the Lords dealing with the Higher Education Free Speech Bill, a bill which I've been involved in, made lots of speeches on. It's called the third reading when that happens. That's effectively when the bill has been amended to reflect the changes made by the Lords, and it then gets sent back to the Commons. And there's a third reading debate. The convention is, in that third reading debate, that the front benchers and the minister thank everybody, like people in the Bill's office, thank each other for cooperation. Generally, it's sort of very pleasant to each other. And the bill, there's a phrase that says, "Let this bill pass," and it then goes trundling off on a gold tray over to the Commons, where they decide whether they accept the Lords' amendments or not. At third reading, what usually happens is, in addition to the front bench spokespeople, backbenchers who've been particularly involved in the bill get a chance to make their comments as well. And again, it's not an attempt to rerun the arguments of the past, but actually to reflect on where you are with the bill. So I had checked, because I was a bit nervous, I've never spoken in a third reading before, I checked with the minister when I would be able to jump up, what kind of length I had. The particular minister said keep it short, no more than 3 minutes, and bear in mind you want to rehearse arguments. So that's what I did, and the film is on social media. But what you don't see in the film is when I stood up to speak, there was a lot of grumbling close by. Some of the Labour backbenchers, and particularly actually the Greens, led by Jenny Jones, who not only were grumbling, because I'm used to that, you don't always hear it in the videos, but that's usually grumbling when I speak, to be fair. But Jenny Jones actually stood up and tried to stop me speaking and said, this is totally inappropriate, this is an abuse of the process. And because the House of Lords is a self-regulating house, if everybody had agreed with her, then I would have had to just stop. But luckily for me, I think people saw that she was just being sectarian, that it was really an attempt at objecting to what I was making a fairly gracious, generous speech, saying that even though I disagreed that the remedy of tort from Clause 4 had been removed, that I'd felt that the bill had at least raised the issues of the attacks on academic freedom on campus, and that in and of itself was a positive step in making people recognise what a problem there was. But Jenny Jones didn't agree with what I was saying and tried to use the rules to try and shut me up, and luckily didn't get away with it. My speech was short and sweet, 3 minutes. Interestingly, in that speech I congratulated Edinburgh University for standing firm under pressure from UCU, the lecturers union, about a film that was due to be shown last night, controversial only in as much as these days trans rights versus women's rights has become such a toxic issue. But the adult human female film that was due to be shown, the union had called for it to be banned, the university shouldn't host it. The university, and this was some backbone in this context, said no, we're going to show it. In fact, the Vice-Chancellor encouraged people to attend. Very sad to report the day after that actually the film wasn't shown because activists, including the LGBTQ officer of the union, basically barred the way in, and the film wasn't shown. And I hope now that Edinburgh University use the encouragement of the debates we've had in Parliament on the new bill to enforce the notion that academic freedom really matters, and make sure that that film is shown to maximum audiences at the university. The next issue I wanted to raise was a new bill that's been proposed by the government, and this is like where you have almost legislation by stealth, which is to make it illegal to have street harassment or catcalling. We've got lots of tourists looking at the House of Lords, which is very nice. But anyway, this is a bill that's been, the notion that we should legislate on this has been floating around, largely coming from the Labour benches, Jess Phillips, and people like that in the House of Commons, and the government have been rather reluctant about it, or half-hearted, not sure about it. Certainly wasn't in their legislative programme that they were going to do it. But now what's happened is that Greg Clark, who is a Conservative MP, has actually put in a private members bill on catcalling and street harassment. Private members bills are something that every MP, and indeed every member of the House of Lords, can ballot to get a private members bill, and there's loads of private members bills that are discussed in both houses that get nowhere, to be honest, because they've got no support. It's just an opportunity to raise an issue that you'd like the law to change on, but nobody takes any notice yet. But in this instance, the government think they're being clever because they backed Greg Clark's private member bill and have agreed that it's now going to become the law. And as a consequence, we have a situation where people can be threatened with 2 years imprisonment for catcalling, for wolf whistling. By the way, all fairly unpleasant activities, for driving slowly past someone, which can be seen as harassment. We've actually got plenty of laws on the statute book to deal with all of this, by the way, in terms of serious sexual harassment, street harassment. The danger is that this is going to have a stifling atmosphere on interpersonal relationships in the public sphere. It's going to criminalise all manner of activities which really the state has no business criminalising. This is at a time when there's just been a huge report out about the prison population being massively overcrowded, not enough space. It also just feels really sick on the day, it's kind of, in the last couple of days we've had Zara Alina murderer. She was brutally raped and murdered by somebody who was well known to the prison authorities actually as a consistent violent and sexual offender, was out on release but actually should have been incarcerated in a different context, and actually was free to murder. In other words, there are serious sexual violent crimes that are not being resolved, where policing and the criminal justice system are not dealing with them, and yet the government take this absolutely spineless virtue signalling attempt to give the police more jobs, to equate trivial if unpleasant behaviour on the streets with that sexual violence, as a way of ticking a box, getting one over on the Labour Party and effectively saying, oh look how much we're doing for fighting violence against girls and women. It's an atrocious, cynical piece of legislation making, in my view. And then finally, in the Public Order Bill, and this is a more positive thing to end on, the something that showed the Lords maybe at its best, which was that Baroness Boycott, Rosie Boycott, and Baroness Chakrabarti put forward an amendment on the Public Order Bill, effectively defending journalists from being picked up by the police on demonstrations. And it is true that the Public Order Bill is so wide in its reach that one of the potential victims of it might well be people going about recording demonstrations, acting as journalists, even citizen journalists. No one's trying to be naive about the fact they'll all have official working for the Times or what have you when they're filming Just Stop Oil protesters. But nonetheless, they put forward this amendment and they really argued for it very strongly. And I felt that it was a very important amendment to support. And Baroness Boycott and Baroness Chakrabarti were probably a bit surprised to get my support. Actually, everybody from across the houses, we're all different parties, supported this amendment, which is to say, you can be, even if you're for the Public Order Bill and you think that they should be incarcerating, locking up every Just Stop Oil protester and all. I don't, I'm just saying. If you do, if you think this bill is good, the problem with the way it's drawn is that it will attack media freedom. And media freedom, press freedom, is part of the important backbone of free speech in this country, and we should protect it. And this was a very modest amendment that simply indicated that the police had to make sure that they didn't go against the spirit of media freedom and arrest journalists, and we've seen recently that they have done just that. And everybody called on the government to accept the amendment. The government, as usual, the minister kind of, fudged it, didn't say what he's going to do. But I actually think we might have made a bit of an impact on that debate, and it was refreshing to have a collegiate atmosphere, because often it's quite sectarian, to raise an issue which I think would not have been raised had it not been that amendment put in the Lords, hadn't come up in the Commons at all. So I hope the government will accept it. So sometimes the Lords can do something very positive. That's it. I will do a final roundup of the year next week. We're almost in our last bit of the Lords being at work before Christmas. I'm about to go and do a speech now on the Arts Council's attempt at levelling up arts funding by giving lots of money to northern arts organisations. But I'm going to reveal that they aren't really, and that really this is a dumbing down effect that patronises particularly working class people in the north, and is completely philistine. It's not a piece of legislation, it's just a debate that's been called, but I feel passionately about the mess that the Arts Council have made of this, so I'm off inside to do that now.